which could eventually be able to move variable energy, because we wanted them to move on renewable energy. So I think it requires a lot of strategic thinking. And I must confess, although I'm not within the government, I don't get the sense that there is that intellectual or technical ministry's input into the design of some of these things going on. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts.
No, thank you for sharing them. I think the kind of detail and the granularity that Dr. Akhtar talked about is something all of us need to be invested in. Those are the issues that actually make the transition possible from just talking about an issue to actually understanding what it would take. One of the people on the panel, and this goes for pretty much the entire panel, but Ahmed, you actually have also worked for a substantial period of time in the ASEAN region, and of course your current job is about connecting people. That's what telcos and technology is all about. Many of Pakistan's complaints about itself, about not having the kind of export profile that we should, those can be solved through dramatic improvement in what we export to the world in terms of technology, products and services. Again, this is one of those things, just like regional connectivity, we've been talking about for, it feels like almost 2 decades, and yet the reality is that, you know, the FBR will come and shut down the country's largest telco head office. That, I mean, there's many other things that have happened, including to Telenor, even, I mean, you know, people complain about Zong not being touched, but I think even Zong suffers when some of the decisions around spectrum auction and taxation are taken. So in an environment that seems to be hostile to technology and telcos, how are we supposed to be hopeful about digital connectivity? And again, Ali, that's a question I'm going to bring back to you. But Ahmed, sitting in the position that you're in, how do you put on a smiley face and pretend that this is actually doable in the environment that you currently operate in?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for finally getting to me on the 3rd attempt. Telecom sector is kind of used to getting ignored when we talk about infrastructure, which is sad. So I almost gate crashed at the event this morning. I called Asfar and I said, listen, you're talking about... And how come... Okay. So I called Asfar and I said, listen, how come you're talking about infrastructure, but you don't really have anybody from the telecom sector? And that's the legacy mindset. Right? We have to change that mindset, because infrastructure is not just roads, hospitals, schools. It's also digital connectivity. And telecom is not just a sector as we have traditionally looked at it, it's a sector of sectors. So this sector will enable education, this sector will enable health, this sector will enable banking, it will enable commerce. And when we only take a very limited view of it, we end up making the wrong decisions, as the government has in the past, and I'm saying it very non-partisan manner. We look at telecom and smartphones as luxury convenience factors. These are essential services that we must afford to every single Pakistani. And as we are seeing what's happening in Balochistan and Sindh and even Punjab in the floods, your reliance on connectivity and communication is at the same level as it would be in a war level. So what we have to change in Pakistan, unfortunately, we're already late to the party, is the mindset around telecommunications and the need for robust digital connectivity, a robust, expansive digital infrastructure. And if we continue to keep on looking at it as a governmental value capture, whether it is through the spectrum fees or right-of-way issues that all of the telecom fiber companies face, then we are basically going to be milking the cow today. And we can't afford to do that anymore. Now, most of us, perhaps even in this room, will have an impression about the telecom sector. It must be extremely profitable because everybody has a phone. There are 190 million SIM connections. Every person has a smartphone, which is actually factually not correct. Only 50% do. But while we have made a lot of progress over the years, in cricketing terms, I would say that our run rate is improving, but it is not at the required run rate level. And some of the comparisons, and I hate to make comparisons with India, unless it's Babar Azam and Virat Kohli. Other than that comparison, I'm kind of hesitant making comparisons with India because I think that train has already left the station. India last week had a 5G auction where they raised $19 billion. In Pakistan, there isn't a 5G case even if the spectrum was offered free. So this is how far we have been left behind. And in most of the comparisons, with the exception of affordability, Pakistan digital readiness or internet readiness is at the last quartile of every single comparison we make. Certainly not a position that I would like to be in, I would like our industry to be in. And while we're talking about regional trade and regional connectivity, eventually commerce will happen in different ways from how we have looked at it in the last 20 years. And we are underinvesting and we are looking at this particular sector in a very jaundiced way. And we have to urgently fix our way of thinking, our way of looking at it, and recognizing the importance of this particular sector in the future of Pakistan. The thing that you hold in your hand, I keep on saying it's the remote control to your life. You will get educated on it, the smartphone. You will do commerce on it. You will get medical advice on it. You will obviously talk to each other on it as we have in the past. But it is a lot more than just a communication tool. Unless we change that mindset and unless we actually have an ambition as a country that there should be a smartphone in every hand and an internet in every home, we were not going to fulfill any of the connectivity ambitions that perhaps this forum would like to achieve and this country deserves to achieve. So that would be my plea. I still have a smile on my face because every single day we get up, we have to try to convince our colleagues in the government, whether it's this government, previous government, or future government. It's not that they do not recognize the importance of it. I think we operate in a complex environment where we have imperatives, and some of those imperatives are governmental value capture in the short term. And that is very misleading. The World Bank has shown that whenever there's a 10% increase in broadband penetration, there's a 1.4% increase in the GDP of the country. That's the right lens through which we have to look at it. Pakistan needs digital connectivity. We provide, by the way, I read it somewhere that 130,000 kilometers. I think we have about 70,000 kilometers. Yes, we are connected through 6 cables across the sea, but our infrastructure within the country is woefully weak. And I think that's where we need a different kind of lens to look at this.
Thanks so much, Ahmed, and also thanks for being patient and waiting despite me teasing the audience and you with your name. Everybody was really anticipating that presentation, and it was well worth the wait. Thanks. Dr. Musaddiq Malik, this brings us to you. I wouldn't call you the final speaker because we are going to go back to Ali and ask him to explain and dilate upon some of these issues, because I think the paper does address some of them, and I think that we need to think through these things more carefully. But in the position that you're in, one of the conversations that you and I have also had is the potential for what Pakistan can gain in terms of its energy mix. And of course, I've heard you speak about this, but I'd love for you to, again, expand on those opportunities, but also tell us what you think is realistic and what it is that you need from the group here, from the audience here, in terms of thought leadership or public discourse that'll enable you to be able to achieve the connectivity that will lead us to where we want to go in terms of our economic growth. Dr. Musaddiq Malik.
I think the first thing that we need is the participation of a few more ladies. I'm glad you gate crashed, my friend, and now I know why you were interrupted a few times. But I really wish a few thought leader women had also gate crashed the party. And I wish our governor, esteemed ex-governor, had been on the stage. I think it would have looked good. I would just share with you 2 perspectives real quick. The first is the energy perspective, and the second is the trade and growth perspective. And obviously they're interrelated. It's been said a number of times here that countries don't grow, regions grow. And whether it be NAFTA or GCC or ASEAN or Mercosur, no matter how you cut and slice, you've begun to see all across the world that the regions are growing. And in order for regions to grow, in order for a particular country within a region to grow, The lifeline of growth comes from energy. Or may I say, one of the lifelines for growth comes from energy. And therefore, it is not an accident that you have an 8,700 kilometer long gas pipeline, the West-East pipeline, which takes the Turkmenistan gas through Xinjiang province all the way to Shanghai. It is also not an accident that you have the National Unification Pipeline, which is 5,000 kilometers long in Brazil, or the Trans-Saharan Pipeline that connects Nigeria with Algeria, which is 4,000 kilometers, or the Yamal Pipeline, which takes the Russian gas and through Poland and Belarus takes it all the way to Germany. It's because if we are going to grow, and if we are going to grow as a region, then many things have to be integrated. And one of the more important things that needs to be integrated is the energy infrastructure. It needs to be leveraged. So Pakistan also requires both its energy portfolio to broaden, as well as its trade links to expand. These are two very important things. When you look at Pakistan's energy sector, you find that Pakistan has near about 90% exposure to the GCC. So what is the problem? Most of our energy needs, whether they be the LNG needs or the petroleum product needs or the crude, is all coming from the GCC. Well, there's a risk there, and the risk is the Strait of Hormuz. And that's just a 70-kilometer wide kind of little canal through which our entire energy comes through. And if for some reason, for some kind of God-given, God-created reason or human-created reason, if this 70-kilometer canal or the passage is choked, we're going to be tough out of luck. And therefore, it is mission critical strategically for us to broaden our portfolio of energy. Now, in order for us to broaden our portfolio of energy, we began at some point in time to look around. And we found a very important thing which has already been mentioned. We found out that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have enormous hydro energy potential. We also found out that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and most of all Turkmenistan, they have fossil fuels, enormous fossil fuels. Turkmenistan, I believe, is one of the largest gas reserves of the world now. So we said, what is it that they need? And we found out that they don't have any passage for exports. They are land-bound, landlocked, and they cannot export their energy, and they also cannot export their other factor inputs. And what is it that we don't have? We don't have the energy. We have people, we have infrastructure, reasonable infrastructure. I won't say a world-class infrastructure, but reasonable infrastructure which is ready to grow. But starting from, if you look back over the past 20 years, you find out every 6 to 5 years, 5 years, 7 years cycle, we go into darkness. We talk about so much energy, and then we go into darkness. Then we build up energy, then we say so much energy, then we go into darkness. So this cyclicality is costing us a lot. By one World Bank estimate, just a few years ago, we were basically losing about 2.5% of our GDP simply because we did not have energy. We need energy. They have energy. We have ports. We have infrastructure. We can export. They want to export. So it appeared to be a natural kind of, there appeared to be a natural synergy. So we started a bunch of projects a few years ago to diversify our energy risk. We started with CASA 1000. This was the Tajikistan and the Kyrgyzstan hydro energy. And we cut a deal or structured a deal where we could have access to anywhere from 1,000 megawatts to 1,300 megawatts of low-cost energy. And as my friend told me today, when we initially began, Harun told me, it was a 3-cent energy, very inexpensive energy. But when you started to load the security costs onto it, by the end of it, it became a 13-cent energy, which was not worth anyone's while. So 3 cent was okay. 13 cent was not. And what stood in the way was the cost of security. So this energy we can only have through Afghanistan. And the cost of insecurity or instability in Afghanistan was about 10 cents. So there's so much for CASA 1000 or 1300. The second project that we initiated was TAPI. TAPI was Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. It was a brilliant, fantastic project, very large project. Some people believe that it was simply there to mitigate the IP, the Iran pipeline project that we had initiated. But other people have a broader view and they think, no, in itself, it was a fantastic project. This was a 1,850-kilometer long project, which was worth about, which would require an investment of about $10 billion. But that was not the kicker. The kicker was not that the project required $10 billion. The kicker was that we could have access to most of that energy that was going to flow through the pipes for less than $500 million. And of those $500, the only amount that we had to invest in the way of equity was $200 million. So for $200 million, we could have 1.3 BCDF of gas from TAPI. So what went wrong? What stood in our way was Afghanistan. The same problem that we had with CASA 1000. We had the cost of instability. We had the cost of insecurity. And when you build the cost of instability and insecurity into what otherwise looks like a fantastic program, what do you end up having? Nothing. So what do we have? Nothing. We still have that paper plan, which is not going anywhere. The third project that we had was Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. And this was another very good project, 780 kilometers of pipeline that would connect Gwadar all the way to Nawab Shah for about $2.2 billion. And we were well on our way. And what happened? What stood in our way? What stood in our way was regional instability again. So we had Iran. Strategically, what we wanted to do was diversify our portfolio. We want to mitigate the risk of the Strait of Hormuz and diversify our energy portfolio. And we found out, exploring everything, that in trying to mitigate that risk, we assumed the risk of Afghanistan's instability, and we assumed the risk of sanctions on Iran. So it didn't work very well. Now I'll basically shift gears. I'm not going to talk about, because I don't think today's topic is about the diversification of energy portfolio, because we have a fantastic renewable energy program which would use our indigenous resources to diversify our energy. But that's not the topic for today, because you're talking about regional connectivity. I can talk about it if there are any questions, but not for right now. But I would suffice to say that it is such a fantastic program that the government of Qatar has committed an enormous amount of money into that renewables policy, new policy that we're putting together. So hopefully we'd be able to absorb their investment appetite and bring in a lot of foreign investments into the renewable energy, and that would diversify our risk to a certain extent. I would now just take a couple of minutes and talk about growth. Our growth mantra is going to come from the aspirations, our aspirations, as well as the aspirations of our neighbor China. China, for its own political stability, requires a balance, an economic balance between the eastern provinces and the western provinces. Therefore, they're committed to basically growing their western provinces, having growth, I believe, from 3% to 13% or 12% is their target of growth for the western provinces. And the only connectivity, much like Central Asia, or one of the connectivity pathways goes through Pakistan all the way to Gwadar. So that basically, as you guys know, the Belt and Road Initiative, therefore, is mission critical for the western provinces to grow. And Gwadar is the exit to ocean. Other than Gwadar, there's no exit to ocean that they have in the way of growing their western provinces. So our entire initiative, CPEC initiative, as well as the Port of Gwadar, become very important. So we have a chance. We can, if we can basically draw the energy from the Central Asian states. We can possibly put a train at Gwadar and use that train, the LNG train, to begin to export LNG and not just become the importers of energy, but start to participate with the Central Asian countries to become an exporter of energy from the Gwadar site. That could be one thing. The second important and interesting thing could be Chinese participation in this gas pipeline and setting up, so to say, a petrochemical city or cluster around Gwadar. And that basically is an area in which Pakistan can also participate, the private sector, the multinational corporations, the Chinese, and the CPEC. The entire belt can participate, and we can build up a petrochem downstream industrial cluster and become exporters of that. Obviously, if we do these two things, many other things would happen. And all of these corridors, the economic corridors and the industrial parks that we've planned around the CPEC, kind of the entire length of the way, they would hopefully come about and energize Pakistan. And for that energizing Pakistan towards economic development, we would have the energy required. We already have the manpower, and we have a reasonable infrastructure that we will unleash towards our growth. In summary, in regional connectivity and regional growth and Pakistan's position in that regional growth, what is the asset that we have? The asset that we have is our geopolitical situation and our foreign policy. What is the problem that we have? The problem that we have is our situation, location, and our foreign policy. So I would only finish by saying that one of the ways of finding security is through peace. And perhaps this is the time to try it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I'm really glad that you did what you did and the way that you did it in, because that brings us back to Ambassador Ali Jahangir Siddiqui. Ali, with your permission, I just want to lay out what's going to happen for the rest of the evening. One, I'd like you to maybe walk us through a few of the challenges that were posed in the conversation, not so much to what you're proposing, but certainly to the idea of regional connectivity. I think Moeed spoke about it quite cogently, and I think part of what Dr. Malik presented was also maybe a counterfactual, or certainly a resistance that is innate in those projects, particularly Kaza, TAPI or TAP now, and the gas pipeline. Maybe address those, but also talk about how you've conceived in this paper, because I think one of the most interesting things you did was you distinguished between electricity and gas, whereas in most cases when we talk about this, we bunch it together. So do explain what the logic of how you broke down those four connective tissues was, and also give us a little bit more hope than what Dr. Moeed Yusuf and Dr. Musaddiq Malik are willing to concede this evening.
I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. If I miss answering one of the counterfactuals, just please remind me. I think let's start with what the Honorable Petroleum Minister was saying, which is he came up with a business case that works. So I think the thesis was that just a gas pipeline may not have a business case, but were we to add on one of two or three things, in this case, putting an LNG train, so some of the gas can be exported and we make more money doing that than the cost, then that's a sensible idea. Or having China participate in taking some of the gas that way. So the idea is that there are business cases to be made. And this leads to what you said, what you asked about, Musharraf, why was energy separated into two? Because the business cases of electricity and the business cases of natural gas are quite different. In the case of natural gas, our economy is configured for natural gas. We produce enormous quantities of fertilizer from natural gas. That's a feedstock. It's quite hard to change that. It's possible, but it's incredibly expensive. So we need a certain amount of natural gas in the system simply to produce fertilizer. The alternate is we buy a lot of fertilizer and import that, which is more expensive, but we've spent the money on these fertilizer plants. Fertilizer plants happen to last really forever. You do capex maintenance on them and it just lasts forever. So we have that installed. We have to produce fertilizer. We need gas. Our own natural gas is declining. So the question is, are we solving are we as the government solving the problem of availability of gas, or are we solving the problem of the price of gas? When we speak about just the business case on the basis of price, I don't think that's accurate. We have to first solve for availability of gas, because without it, we will not have fertilizer and many other things. We have new gas-fired, highly efficient power stations, and they need to be fed with gas. And regardless of gas being expensive, those plants are so efficient that they will still be competitive. So the case for gas is very clear. It's first a case of availability to run our economy, and second, it's a case of financial business case for which, as the Honourable Minister pointed out, there are some add-ons and alternates. The case for electricity is less clear. There is a non-financial benefit to having an interconnected electricity grid, which is for frequency stability, which is if there's a problem on your own grid, you can take help from a grid you're connected to. But in our case, that is a small gain. Because it's a small gain, I think the bulk of the electricity argument is an economic one. And the electricity, it is true, A, it's seasonal, and B, it is not so cheap. Although at the moment our electricity prices are very high, we should work on bringing those down. But nevertheless, having said that, electricity cables are not terribly expensive. So for TAPI, the idea was if there's going to be a secure corridor carrying a gas pipeline, we're going to secure it anyway. Just above it, we may consider an electricity line, and below it, a fiber optic line. So that's the general point on the business cases. We have to develop business cases, but in some cases, it is an essential thing for us because the alternate is incredibly expensive and, of course, as the Minister pointed out, dependent on bottlenecks like the Hormuz. Now, with regard to process, I think that there was a number of comments made around process, saying it can't be done because of this hurdle or that hurdle. Well, we've had a close relationship with China for most of our independent life as a country. But that relationship did not crystallize into much beyond a defense relationship until CPEC was created. And how did that happen? Very slowly at first, then very fast. And that was a function of leadership in politics. It was a function of China's own desire. And ultimately, in less than a decade, we spent close to $30 billion of development money. So I think this is a question of, yes, it's been many decades we've been speaking about it. For a long time, we've tried. Yes, there are many hurdles, but we have to define a process that actually makes it work. I would not be one to give up. So what is that process? In the case of CPEC, we had joint working groups with China, political buy-in from both sides first, then joint working groups, interministerial coordination on both sides within the joint working groups. And then, of course, there was the availability of money and resources from China. I'm not saying we can follow the same route because we don't have the same dynamics or resources, but let's start with something small. Let's start with some low-hanging fruit that we can deliver to demonstrate to the other countries that despite all of the challenges that were highlighted and others that we have not yet done, we can deliver something. And what would that be? I would pick digital connectivity. My point on our domestic infrastructure in telecoms was it's far superior to Central Asia and Afghanistan. And once it's in the ground, we can upgrade it. So the point is, a fiber optic line is cheap, and it gets buried under the ground. And you have to worry less about it being a problem from a security perspective than a gas pipeline. So let's bury a high-speed fiber optic line, connect to the Afghan system and the loop they have, and reconnect it in the north, and start providing connectivity. Let's give that as a test case. This project will cost in the scores of millions of dollars on either side. And it can be delivered quite fast, and that pipe would be buried. And that would be a great first step to show what can be done without forming the complex infrastructure, the soft infrastructure of project delivery, of a joint working group, of lots of financing, of the soft infrastructure. And I must acknowledge the work of the Commerce Ministry, and Swale Farooqi Saab is here from there. The soft infrastructure, which is already being put in place, but without all of that, we can just connect it. So I would say there's some low-hanging fruit to demonstrate which can be done, and then we work on the bigger projects. I'll make one final point, and I'll hand over to you, and please tell me if I missed something. I feel quite let down by the generation before me. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, in the face of all of these problems, which I will argue are less in the case of regional connectivity today than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But in the face of all these problems, do we not tackle the problem? And do we let our children be disappointed with us?
Thank you, Ambassador Siddiqui. I think, I was going to make the point, and I think I would like to reiterate it. I think I don't think there's any cynicism. I think what Moeed said and what Dr. Malik said are absolutely right. And I don't see Haroon here anymore, but, he's worked a lot on process. And, it's very clear that the Pakistani state, as it's configured today, is simply incapable of conducting the sophisticated and nuanced and detailed negotiations and engagements that are required for doing this with multiple countries. I think you're right to acknowledge the Commerce Ministry. It takes an entire division and, like all of their life force to focus for a sustained period of time to manage this with one country. And I know Farooqi Saab is working on multiple countries right now in the run-up to the SCO conference, which is going to be another opportunity for us to integrate this into our national thinking. But I do think that just because something hasn't worked for a long time is no reason for us to throw in the towel and say, this is never going to work. I think the fact that the business case isn't compelling, Moeed, is all the more reason for a group like this to really be interested in this conversation, which is my way of asking you to now, A, respond to the multilateral question, but also to maybe explain your realism a little further, because I know that you're not a pessimist.
Thank you. Since you singled me out, and I think the sitting minister, I don't want to leave an impression that Pakistan's moving in some other direction. Look, the point is, I invested more time on connectivity. I think Commerce Ministry sitting here, I see the Foreign Office together than perhaps anybody at that time, looking at this strategically. The point I'm making is that much of the conversation we've had and what Ali is saying, it's a given. I mean, there is no option but to move in this direction. So, throwing in the towel is not even a conversation. I think the starting point of the conversation goes beyond Ali's paper, because there is no debate on that this is what needs to happen, and these are the potential projects, areas where we can go. Let me say 2 or 3 things. Again, you're going to call me a pessimist, but I really want to point out where we were getting stuck. Ali says digital connectivity is the low-hanging fruit. There are people in this audience who will bail me out. It took us months to agree how to get a truck from Central Asia into Pakistan without a hassle. It took us months to get to a point where an Afghan truck would be allowed to go to Karachi and a Pakistani truck would cross over into Central Asia. The point I'm making is, I think the problem is we have tried to do big things without having any foundation to show that this can work. There's a lot of cynicism, there's a lot of people who say, well, this is just not worth it, and that's not where we want to go. So I think if Ali were to write another paper or one of us were to do it, here is what I would say. Let's take 5, 6, 7, 10 doable things in the next 2 to 3 years. Point out the business case, but then draw up an action matrix to say who has to do what to get us there. I think that will then drive this conversation beyond, no, it can't happen. I think in some of the comments we're hearing, it's again the same thing. Geopolitics has to fix itself to go to this. I don't think it's going to work that way. It's too complicated in this region. So you've got to come at it from the business case and then move forward. Just 2 other quick points. One, I think we need 2 conversations, and 2 very healthy, constructive conversations. I don't know, Asfar, maybe your group can do this. One is a public sector, private sector conversation. how does the private sector convince the public sector that they have to lead this and the public sector has to facilitate? And with all due respect to everybody, I mean, I was part of that system. We have to get out of this mindset that the private sector needs to be regulated, otherwise they're going to run away with things and something's going to go horribly wrong. We only need to facilitate, and the private sector has to find that business case. That's one. So public sector, private sector conversation has to happen. The second one is a conversation with the people who put up this business case and the economists in the room and the business people in the room and the security. So people like me and people who are arguing, Ali is not that, but a lot of the executives sitting here, there is no conversation. So what happens? You create a plan in your world on how connectivity should happen, right? So we've heard this project will happen because it has this much gas is going to come through. I will look at it and say, sorry, somebody can blow it up. No, the border's not ready. There's, I have a geopolitical. We need to sit down and figure out where that sweet spot is. Because all of Pakistan's connectivity issues are going to be resolved through a political economy lens, neither a security nor an economic lens.
Thanks. I think that element was missing in the conversation. It's valuable, and I'm glad you brought it up. Minister Saab ki ijazat se, because I do want to bring you back into the conversation, Dr. Saab. लेकिन ये private sector क्योंकि बात हो रही थी, तो मैं चाह रहा था कि ग़ियास खान फिर से जो है इसमें आपने काफ़ी ये you heard a lot of the sort of both the case for perhaps connectivity optimism, which might be a new term, and connectivity realism. I think if somebody was to ask me where I'm leaning, I think I'm certainly leaning in the direction that the leadership in this conversation has to come from the private sector, because the public sector is constrained by a number of factors. We've talked about some of them. There's a long list. Ghayas, do you see that emerging as a reality, or do you think there are not enough world ambition level businesses in our country that just won't happen, that people are too busy? I shouldn't even say rent seeking. I think lots of businesses are too busy trying to survive in their domestic markets, in their local markets. So how do we get a business sector, a private sector, business leaders that are ambitious and hungry enough to be interested in this conversation and then to lead the conversation? Because जो लोग अभी तक lead करते रहे, उनसे ये काम नहीं हुआ है. I think that much acknowledgement is certainly merited. Yes?
Yeah. So I think it's a great point and number of things that need to happen. First of all, we have to understand that capital will go to opportunities which give the best risk-adjusted return. If you're going to have rent-seeking opportunities in the country, and blame all the companies for it, including Engro perhaps, I'm being very open about it. Why would businesses take risks, right? And that is the responsibility of the government, which drafts policies and creates an enabling environment. So I completely agree with the notion that private sector has to lead, but the government needs to create an enabling environment by removing these inefficiencies which are there in the market, by getting out of business, and by coming up with long-term policies which will stand the test of time. When investors come and invest in with a particular government in charge, and the next government comes and questions it, that breaks confidence. So I think if you want this to prosper, remove inefficiencies, penalize undocumented sector, government should get out of business, deregulate as much as possible, and come up with long-term policies, whether it's in petrochemicals, whether it's in agriculture, overall industrial policy, what have you. And then also be mindful of the fact that when you're creating when we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about international investments, and I can tell you that if a company like Engro wishes to invest more than $10 million in a country outside Pakistan, it will go right up to the cabinet for approval. And that's okay, because the reality is that we are very cash strapped, right? We're in a massive foreign exchange crisis situation. So it's kind of understandable. But when you put regional connectivity front and center for economic growth, which is an important pillar for national security, then you have to think this through over decades, right? And I guess that's what it comes down to.
No, I think that's a really, I think quite a brilliant point and a great segue. Amir, you know, this issue of random new taxes on cell phones or on phone calls or on data, this is exactly what, in a sense, Ghias also acknowledges, and I know you do too, that the government has legitimate revenue needs. And so, you know, जब ज़्यादा pressure होता है FBR पे, you know, सियासी लीडरान से, तो वो जाके जो है, उनको पता है सबसे आसान ये है कि क्योंकि multinationals हैं और इनके ऊपर, you know, इनके ऊपर ये tax लागू करना आसान है, तो आके जो है वो नया tax ठोक देते हैं. They're not doing it out of hatred for regional connectivity or hatred for connectivity or hatred for digital. They're doing it because of the compulsions of that moment. Just like the compulsion to restrict the, you know, so-called capital flight if big firms were to start investing in USD denominated, you know, in currency, in